Last time we heard how innocent animals died in order for God to make acceptable clothing to hide Adam and Eve's shame. Knowing the terrible prospects of them eating from the tree of life and living forever in their current state, God shut them out from the garden. Although they were far from what God intended for them, He gave them the gift of being able to reproduce their lives. 2 sons were born to them, Cain and Abel, who, like their parents, are born outside. They're cut off from the pure, innocent, free access to God that He desired for them and all human beings. Okay, so God continues His narrative by relating to us some events from which we can glean a great deal about Him and also His intentions for man. Also, we see some of the terrible consequences of Adam and Eve's choice for them and for us all to become our own moral compass, to make our own choices independent of God. It's apparent from the way these events are described that God had given Adam and Eve, and through them, Cain and Abel, a way to relate to Him in this new, fallen, cursed context that was now their lives. Of course, as we know, they had no way to restore the relationship they were responsible for fracturing. Their rebellion, their choices, their willing alignment with God's enemy, the stench of death that clung about them, the evil in their hearts, these things all formed a barrier they could never overcome. And God has already shown graphically that any effort of theirs to make themselves presentable or to gloss over what they've done, who they now are, will be a pathetic failure. He simply will not, He cannot accept anything that is the fruit of their corrupted efforts, their tainted hearts, or ours for that matter. But because of this thing about Him that we see illuminated ever more brightly against the dark backdrop of evil human hearts, His grace, He has provided a way for them to approach Him. They were to kill an animal, a sheep, letting its blood flow out. This, and of course the animals dying to clothe Adam and Eve previously, sets a pattern which is to become very familiar in God's narrative from here on. And the principle that emerges is that the only way that God's corrupted image bearers can approach Him is after blood has flowed, resulting in loss of life. The narrative, as we've noted before, is sparse in detail, but immeasurably full and rich in its implications. Cain and Abel approach God, seek perhaps His blessing, or even, we're not told exactly, to venerate Him, to glorify Him. Now clearly Adam's sons take God's existence and presence for granted. And surely they've heard much from their parents over the years and no doubt have been instructed in the appropriate way to come to Him in their fallen state. Cain, the text says, is a cultivator of the ground. He brings crops, no doubt burns them in oblation, in offering. Abel, a shepherd, on the other hand, brings lambs. This is in Genesis chapter 4, verses 2 to 4. And we can safely assume that Abel presents them to God with their throats cut and the blood running out until they're dead. These two would be burnt. And the result? Well, God accepted Abel's offering, but not Cain's. Well, why? Why is that so? It's because any approach to God is only possible under these conditions, when it's made on His terms. That is only after there has been death, when innocent blood has flowed, when the one approaching knows that they, and not the innocent victim, is the one truly deserving of death. And the approach is made in faith, believing what God says about this whole thing. So as the narrative tells us here, this is in Genesis chapter 4, verses 4 to 5, God accepted Abel's approach, but rejected Cain's. Cain had come on his own terms. There had been no death, no bloodshed, no recognition that death was his just deserts. And unlike his brother, he'd not come in faith, believing what God said, what God offered to be true. This matter of coming in faith or by faith is, of course, going to be another major theme that God will regularly illustrate with real events in his story. And we'll also see that human beings constantly get this wrong. By nature, by inclination, by choice, we try to figure it out for ourselves. People want to find acceptance, and blessing, and forgiveness and so forth from God the way they want it to happen. They'll try to make him look different, try to change what he says, to underplay their sin and exaggerate the good. Anything at all to come on their own terms. That will come out more and more in the narrative. But it's something we see and hear around us and in us on a daily basis, don't we? Showing amazing patience, God tries to make Cain see reason. This is in Genesis chapter 4, verse 6 to 7. Let's read that. He says, "Why are you so angry?" The Lord asked Cain. "Why do you look so dejected? You will be accepted if you do what is right. But if you refuse to do what is right, then watch out. Sin is crouching at the door, eager to control you. But you must subdue it and be its master." So he warns him about where his pride and anger are taking him. God's under no obligation to do this, of course, to reason with Cain, to reach out to him. But this is grace shining out yet again. Unfortunately, Cain is beyond listening. Wounded pride, jealousy, his fury have taken hold. The blood is pounding in his head. He wants revenge. And the enemy rides him like a wild animal, driving him on to the terrible conclusion. He invites his brother out to the field and kills him. This is Genesis chapter 4, verse 8. The enemy's hatred of God and his image bearers, even though fallen now, knows no bounds. He loves to destroy life, to crush hope. As with his parents before him, God gives Cain opportunity to respond in contrition and humility. Obviously, it's not for information, but giving Cain a chance to come to his senses, he asks where his brother Abel is. Cain comes back with the infamous line, this is in Genesis chapter 4, verse 9, that "I don't know, am I my brother's guardian or keeper?" He abdicates all responsibility for the life of his fellow image bearer of God. He denies any value for the life that God alone has given to each of them. And then also, like his parents, he hears God utter a terrible curse in response to his rebellion and sin. We see here the high value that God places on the life that he gives to humans. He avenges evil done against others. He punishes the murderous taking of that life. The curse on Cain, again with similarities to his parents, is to be banished from that area and to wander, to be a nomad without a home. You can read the rest of this, of course, in Genesis chapter 4, verses 10 to 15. But even now, there's no sign of any kind of repentance with Cain, no recognition of God's perspective of him and what he's done, no acknowledgement that he deserves whatever is coming to him, that he desperately needs God's help. The whole issue of repentance is going to emerge more out of the narrative as God teaches us what it is, what it's meant to be. And it will become clear that God's definition goes a lot further and deeper than a dictionary and common usage that might say something like to feel or express sincere regret or remorse about one's wrongdoing or sin. So the narrative concludes with the tale of Cain's disastrous life, with some details that paint a very sad picture. Succeeding generations of his descendants increasingly focused on materialism and indifferent to their God, their Creator. This account, again, can be read in Genesis chapter 4, verses 16 to 24. And finally, the narrative flashes back to Adam and Eve. Let's read that in Genesis chapter 4, verses 25 to 26. So Adam had sexual relations with his wife again, and she gave birth to another son. She named him Seth, for she said, God has granted me another son in place of Abel, whom Cain killed. When Seth grew up, he had a son and named him Enosh. At that time, people first began to worship the Lord by name. Finally, the narrative flashes back to Adam and Eve. This is in Genesis chapter 4, verses 25 to 26. And God gives them another son in place of Abel, he says. He, the son, Seth, founded a family line that understood their need for God in their lives. In fact, it says, they began to worship the Lord by name. So clearly, it's possible for the relationship, though fractured by the fall, to be restored when the approach to God is by faith, in faith, on his terms. And that's really what the rest of the narrative is about.